The morning sun was barely up when Margaret Chen stepped off the bus in downtown Los Angeles. Her knees ached from the long journey, but she didn't mind. She had traveled over 3 hours from her small town, carrying nothing but her old leather music folder and a heart full of hope. At 73 years old, she knew this might be her last chance to do something she had dreamed about for decades. The line outside the concert hall was already massive. Hundreds of people stood waiting, most of them young enough to be her grandchildren. Some were practicing dance moves, others were singing scales to warm up their voices. Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach as she joined the end of the line. She clutched her music folder a little tighter, feeling the worn leather under her fingertips. This folder had been with her for over 50 years. A young girl in front of her turned around and smiled politely. "Hi, are you here to support someone?" she asked, assuming Margaret was a mother or grandmother accompanying a contestant. Margaret smiled back gently. "No, dear, I'm here to audition," she replied. The girl's eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly recovered and said, "Oh, that's wonderful. Good luck." But not everyone was so kind. As the morning wore on and the line slowly moved forward, Margaret couldn't help but notice the stares and whispers. 2 young men behind her were talking loudly enough for her to hear. "Dude, what is she doing here?" one of them said, laughing. "Maybe she's lost," the other replied. Margaret pretended not to hear them, but her hands trembled slightly as she opened her folder and looked at her sheet music for the 100th time that morning. The production crew started making their rounds, looking for interesting people to interview on camera. They were searching for stories that would make good television. A young woman with bright pink hair, a man who could juggle while singing, a group of dancers with matching outfits. But when the producer spotted Margaret standing quietly in line, his eyes lit up with a different kind of interest. She would make perfect television, he thought, but not for the reasons Margaret hoped. A cheerful production assistant approached with a cameraman following close behind. Her smile was wide but didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hello there. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" she said, speaking slowly and loudly as if Margaret might be hard of hearing. Margaret nodded politely, though she felt a bit uncomfortable with the camera pointing at her face. "So what brings you here today?" the assistant asked, holding the microphone close. Margaret took a breath and spoke clearly. "I've been playing piano since I was 5 years old. My grandson saw the show and told me I should audition. He said my music deserves to be heard." Her voice was soft but steady, filled with a quiet dignity that came from a lifetime of experiences. The assistant's smile grew wider, more amused. "That's sweet. And what kind of music do you play? Do you do chopsticks at the senior center?" She giggled at her own joke, and the cameraman smirked behind his equipment. A few people in line nearby heard the comment and started laughing too. Margaret felt her cheeks flush, but she kept her composure. "I play classical music," Margaret said simply. "Rachmaninoff, Chopin, Beethoven." The assistant nodded, clearly not really listening, already thinking about how this footage would look on TV. "Well, that's just adorable," she said in a sugary voice. "We'll see you on stage, honey." She patted Margaret's shoulder and moved on to find other contestants, the cameraman already reviewing the footage and grinning. Margaret stood there for a moment, feeling smaller than she had when the day began. Around her she could hear more whispers and giggles. A group of young women were looking at their phones, probably scrolling through social media while they waited. One of them glanced at Margaret and whispered to her friend, who then looked over and laughed. Margaret wondered if maybe this was a mistake. Maybe she was too old for this. Maybe she should just go home. But then she thought about her grandson, Tommy, who had filled out the application for her. She remembered his excited face when he told her about the show. "Grandma, you're so talented. People need to hear you play." He had driven her to the bus station that morning at 5 a.m, hugging her tight and telling her he believed in her. She couldn't let him down. More importantly, she couldn't let herself down. She also thought about David, her late husband. He had passed away 2 years ago, and not a day went by that she didn't miss him. David had always been her biggest supporter. When she had given up her music career to raise their children, he had made her promise that one day when the time was right, she would play again. Not just at home for family gatherings, but really play, the way she had always dreamed of doing. "Promise me," he had said during his final days, holding her wrinkled hand in his. "Promise me you won't let your music die with me." She had promised. The line continued to move slowly forward. Margaret watched as contestants went in through the big doors and came out either crying with joy or disappointment. The wait was long and tiring. Her feet hurt in her sensible shoes and her back ached from standing, but she didn't complain. She had waited 50 years for this moment. She could wait a few more hours. Finally, after what felt like forever, a staff member called out a group of numbers, including hers. "Numbers 45 through 60, please come forward." Margaret's heart jumped. This was it. She gathered her folder and her purse and followed the other contestants through the doors. As she walked past the young people who had laughed at her earlier, she kept her head high. She had nothing to prove to them. She only had something to prove to herself. Inside the building, the atmosphere changed completely. It was busy and chaotic, with people running around with clipboards and headsets. Staff members were shouting instructions. Cameras were everywhere, and bright lights made everything feel surreal. Margaret felt overwhelmed, but kept moving forward, following the signs and the flow of people. She was directed to a waiting area where other contestants sat nervously preparing for their moment on stage. Some were pacing back and forth, others sat with their eyes closed, meditating or praying. Margaret found a quiet corner and sat down, placing her folder on her lap. She closed her eyes and took several deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. In her mind, she could hear David's voice. "You've got this, Maggie. Just play from your heart like you always do." She smiled at the memory and felt a tear slip down her cheek. Yes, she thought, I'll play from my heart. The cameras had found their target. Margaret didn't know it yet. But in the control room upstairs, the producers were already excited about the footage they had captured in the audition line. They were watching the playback, laughing and planning how they would edit it. "This is gold," one of them said. The grandma pianist. "We'll build it up as a disaster, then who knows, maybe she'll surprise us. Either way, it's good TV." Back outside in the line, Margaret had no idea what was being said about her. She was just trying to stay calm and focused. The morning had turned into afternoon and the California sun was getting hot. Someone passed around bottles of water, and Margaret gratefully accepted one. Her throat was dry, both from the heat and from nerves. The production assistant from earlier returned, this time with a full camera crew. There were 3 cameras now, plus a sound guy with a big fuzzy microphone on a pole, and another producer holding a clipboard. They had decided Margaret was worth a longer segment. The assistant's smile was even bigger than before, which somehow made Margaret more nervous. "Hi again," the assistant said brightly. "We'd love to get a bit more footage with you if that's okay. Just a few more questions for the audience at home." Margaret nodded, though she felt her stomach tighten. She had never been comfortable with attention, and all these cameras pointed at her felt intimidating. "So, tell us your name and age," the assistant began. Margaret cleared her throat. "My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm 73 years old." The assistant's eyebrows raised dramatically for the camera. 73, wow. "And you're here to audition for America's Hidden Talents. That's so brave." The way she said brave made it sound like Margaret was doing something crazy, like skydiving or lion taming. "Now, Margaret, tell us honestly. Why are you really here? Is this like a bucket list thing?" The assistant tilted her head, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. "I suppose you could say that. My husband passed away 2 years ago, and before he died, he made me promise to share my music with the world. I've been playing piano my whole life, but I gave up performing when I had children. I raised 4 kids and helped raise 6 grandchildren. Music was always there, but it was just for family and friends." The assistant nodded along, but her expression showed she was already thinking about the next question. "That's sweet. So you play at family gatherings? Birthday parties, that kind of thing?" She was clearly trying to paint a picture of Margaret as a hobbyist, someone who played Happy Birthday and simple tunes. Margaret felt a flash of frustration but kept her voice gentle. "I play classical music. I actually studied at Juilliard when I was younger." This caught the assistant off guard for just a second. "Juilliard, really?" There was doubt in her voice, and Margaret could see the producer behind the camera make a face that said he didn't believe her. "Yes," Margaret continued. "I was accepted when I was 18. I studied there for 3 years before I left to get married. That was a different time. Women had to make different choices back then." The assistant recovered quickly, her smile returning. "Well, that's quite a story. But that was what, 50 years ago?" She laughed lightly, and the implication was clear. Whatever skills Margaret might have had back then were surely gone now. 55 years ago, Margaret corrected quietly. but I've never stopped playing. I practice every single day. Every day. At 73? That's so dedicated. The assistant's tone was the kind you'd use with a child who insisted they could fly. So what are you going to play for us today? Margaret's eyes brightened a little. This was something she could talk about with genuine passion. I'm going to play part of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It's one of the most beautiful pieces ever written. The assistant blinked, clearly having no idea what that was. Rachmaninoff? She said, completely butchering the pronunciation. Some people in line laughed. Margaret gently corrected her. Rachmaninoff. He was a Russian composer. The piece is quite challenging technically, but it's worth it for the emotional depth. The cameraman zoomed in on Margaret's hands. They were wrinkled and spotted with age, the joints slightly swollen from arthritis. To anyone watching, these didn't look like hands that could play anything challenging. The assistant noticed where the camera was pointing and jumped on it. Those hands have seen a lot of life, haven't they? Do you have any trouble playing with arthritis? Margaret looked down at her hands. These hands that had held babies, cooked thousands of meals, wiped away tears, held her husband's hand as he took his last breath. Yes, I have arthritis, she admitted. Some mornings my fingers are quite stiff. But I do exercises and I manage. When I start playing, the pain seems to fade away. The music is stronger than the pain. The assistant exchanged a look with the producer that Margaret caught. It was a look that said, "This is going to be a train wreck, but great television." The assistant wrapped up the interview with exaggerated enthusiasm. Well, Margaret, we cannot wait to see you on that stage. Best of luck. She emphasized the word luck as if Margaret would need a miracle to get through this. As the camera crew moved away to find their next subject, Margaret heard them talking amongst themselves. They weren't being quiet. Poor thing, one of them said. She seems nice, but this is going to be painful to watch. Another laughed. Yeah, but that's what makes good TV. The judges are going to rip her apart. Margaret sat back down, her folder clutched to her chest. Around her, other contestants were still warming up, full of energy and confidence. A young man was doing vocal runs that echoed through the parking lot. A dance group was running through their choreography for the 10th time. Everyone seemed so sure of themselves, so certain they belonged here. Margaret suddenly felt very old and very foolish. What was she thinking? These people were professionals, or at least they were young enough to become professionals. They had their whole lives ahead of them. She was just an old woman with a dream that should have died decades ago. Maybe the producers were right to laugh. Maybe this was just a silly bucket list item. A last desperate grasp at something that was never meant to be. But then she opened her folder and looked at the sheet music inside. The pages were yellow with age, covered in pencil marks and notes she had made over the years. She had played this piece hundreds of times. She knew every note, every phrase, every emotion. This wasn't just music to her. This was her life, her heart, her soul poured onto paper. When she played this piece, she wasn't just an old woman. She was every age she had ever been. She was the 18-year-old girl at Juilliard, full of dreams. She was the young mother playing lullabies for her babies. She was the grieving widow playing through her tears. She was all of it all at once. A staff member with a clipboard appeared. Margaret Chen. Margaret looked up, her heart pounding. Yes, that's me. The staff member smiled, a genuine smile unlike the fake ones from the camera crew. You're in the next group going backstage. It'll be about 30 minutes until you're on stage. Are you ready? Margaret stood up, her legs shaky but determined. She thought about David one more time. She thought about Tommy believing in her. She thought about that 18-year-old girl who had so much talent and so many dreams. Yes, Margaret said, surprising herself with how firm her voice sounded. I'm ready. The backstage area was like nothing Margaret had ever experienced. It was a maze of hallways painted black, with thick cables running along the floors and walls. People rushed past wearing headsets, talking urgently into them about lighting cues and camera angles. The energy was electric but also chaotic, and Margaret felt like she had stepped into a different world. She followed a young intern who was leading her group of contestants deeper into the building. There were 5 of them in total. Besides Margaret, there was a young man who was a rapper, twin sisters who sang pop songs, and a teenage boy who played guitar. They all looked nervous, but their nervousness seemed different from Margaret's. They were nervous with excitement, bouncing on their feet, still practicing their performances under their breath. Margaret was nervous with fear, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. First time on a TV show? The rapper asked Margaret kindly. His name tag said Deshaun and he had kind eyes. Margaret nodded. Yes, first time. I'm absolutely terrified, she admitted with a small laugh. Deshaun smiled. Me too, actually. But you know what my mom always tells me? She says fear and excitement feel the same in the body. It's just our mind that decides which one it is. Maybe try thinking of it as excitement? Margaret appreciated his kindness. That's good advice. Your mother sounds wise. Deshaun grinned. She is. She's probably at home right now watching this on TV and crying already. They both laughed, and Margaret felt a tiny bit of her nervousness ease. At least there was one person here who didn't see her as a joke. They were led into a large waiting room that had been set up with chairs, mirrors, and a refreshment table. A makeup artist was there, ready to touch up anyone who needed it. She took one look at Margaret and frowned. "Honey, did anyone do your makeup?" she asked. Margaret shook her head. "I just put on a little powder this morning." The makeup artist sighed. "Well, come here. We need to at least make sure you don't look washed out on camera." Margaret sat in the makeup chair while the artist worked quickly, brushing powder on her face and adding a touch of color to her cheeks and lips. "You're brave for doing this," the artist said quietly while she worked. "I've been doing makeup for this show for 3 seasons, and I've seen a lot of people come through here. Not many your age, though." Margaret wasn't sure if that was a compliment or another subtle way of saying she didn't belong. Through the walls, Margaret could hear the muffled sounds of the show in progress. There was music, then applause, then the judges' voices, though she couldn't make out the words. Then more applause. A contestant who had performed earlier came back to the waiting room, tears streaming down her face. The twin sisters rushed over to her. "What happened? Did you make it through?" The girl shook her head, sobbing. "They said I was boring. They said I sounded like every other singer they'd heard today." Margaret's stomach twisted. If they were that harsh with a young, talented singer, what would they say to her? She tried to focus on her breathing, something her yoga instructor had taught her. Breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, breathe out for 4 counts. But her mind kept racing. What if she froze on stage? What if her arthritis acted up and her fingers wouldn't cooperate? What if she forgot the music even though she knew it by heart? A stage manager poked his head into the room. "Deshaun, you're up next. Come with me." Deshaun stood up, rolling his shoulders and shaking out his arms. He looked at Margaret and gave her a thumbs up. "You've got this, Mrs. Chen. Go show them what real music sounds like." Then he was gone, following the stage manager down the dark hallway. Margaret could hear him being introduced on stage. The host's voice boomed through the speakers. "Please welcome Deshaun Williams." There was applause and then silence as he must have started performing. Margaret strained to hear, but the walls were too thick. After what felt like forever but was probably only 3 minutes, there was an explosion of applause and cheering. The judges must have liked him. Margaret felt genuinely happy for him, but also more nervous for herself. The twin sisters went next, then the guitar player. Each time, Margaret listened for the audience reaction. The twins got polite applause, but she heard one judge say something critical, though she couldn't make out the exact words. The guitar player seemed to do well, judging by the cheering. And then it was just Margaret, alone in the waiting room except for the makeup artist who was packing up her supplies. The stage manager returned. He looked at his clipboard, then at Margaret, then back at his clipboard with a confused expression. "Margaret Chen?" he said, as if he couldn't believe that was right. "That's me," Margaret said, standing up and smoothing down her simple blue blouse and black slacks. She had chosen this outfit carefully. It was respectful and neat, the kind of thing she might wear to church. Now she wondered if she should have worn something more flashy, more show business. "All right, follow me," the stage manager said. He was young, probably in his 20s, and he walked fast. Margaret had to work to keep up with him, her sensible shoes clicking on the concrete floor. They walked through more hallways, turned several corners, and went up a ramp. Margaret could hear the show getting louder now. She could hear the host talking, hear the audience laughing at something. They stopped in the wings of the stage, the area just off to the side where the performers waited before going on. From here, Margaret could see everything: the bright stage lights, the 3 judges sitting at their long desk, the huge audience filling the theater seats. There were cameras everywhere, on cranes, on dollies, handheld ones carried by camera operators. The famous host of the show was standing center stage reading from notes on cards. "You'll wait here," the stage manager said. "When he calls your name, walk straight to the piano. The lights will be bright, so don't look directly at them. You'll have about 30 seconds to introduce yourself to the judges. Then you can start playing. Any questions?" Margaret's mouth was too dry to speak, so she just shook her head. The stage manager nodded and walked away, speaking into his headset about the next segment. Margaret stood there in the darkness of the wings, watching the current performer finish their act. It was a magician, and he was doing card tricks. The audience seemed mildly interested, but not amazed. When he finished, the judges gave him polite feedback, but said no, he wouldn't be advancing. The magician's face fell, and he walked off the stage on the opposite side, disappearing into the darkness. The host returned to center stage. "Well, judges, ready for our next performer?" The judges nodded, shuffling papers on their desk. Margaret couldn't see their faces clearly from where she stood, but she recognized them from TV. There was Christina Park, a famous pop singer. There was Robert Jackson, a comedian known for his sharp wit and even sharper insults. And there was Michael Torres, a legendary music producer who had discovered some of the biggest names in the industry. "All right then," the host continued, his voice full of theatrical energy. "Our next performer is 73 years old and says she's going to play classical piano. Please welcome Margaret Chen." The audience applauded, but Margaret could hear the curious murmur underneath it. She took a deep breath, clutched her folder to her chest, and stepped out into the light. The stage was enormous, much bigger than it had looked from the wings. The piano sat at the center, a beautiful black grand piano that seemed to glow under the lights. Margaret walked toward it, her legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. As she walked, she became aware of the cameras following her, the audience watching her, the judges staring at her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a tiny bug under a magnifying glass. But she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, until she reached the piano. She turned to face the judges, her heart hammering so hard she was sure the microphones would pick it up. This was it. There was no turning back now. The lights were even brighter than Margaret had imagined. They were hot too, and she could already feel a bead of sweat forming on her forehead. She stood there in front of the judges' table, feeling small and old and completely out of place. The three judges looked up at her from their seats, and Margaret could read their faces all too clearly. Robert Jackson. The comedian leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, a smirk already forming on his lips. He was the kind of person who made his living saying mean things in funny ways, and Margaret could tell he was already writing jokes in his head. Christina Park, the pop star, had her head tilted to one side with an expression of exaggerated sweetness, like someone looking at a confused puppy. And Michael Torres, the music producer, was barely looking at her at all, flipping through papers as if he had already decided this would be a waste of his time. "Well, hello there," Robert started, his voice booming across the theater. "This is unexpected." The audience laughed right on cue. He had that timing down perfectly, knew exactly when to pause for the laugh. I'll be honest, when they said our next performer was 73, I thought maybe someone had gotten the numbers backwards. "Maybe you're actually 37? More laughter from the audience. Margaret forced a smile, even though her face felt frozen. Christina leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her chin resting on her hands. "Hi, sweetie," she said in that sugary voice that somehow managed to sound both kind and condescending at the same time. "It's so wonderful that you're here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?" She spoke slowly and clearly, as if Margaret might have trouble understanding English. Margaret cleared her throat. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "My name is Margaret Chen. I'm 73 years old. I've been playing piano since I was 5. She paused, trying to remember what else she wanted to say. The lights, the cameras, the hundreds of eyes watching her. It all made her mind feel fuzzy. I studied at Juilliard many years ago, but I left to get married and raise my family. My husband passed away 2 years ago, and before he died, he made me promise to share my music." There was a moment of silence. Christina put her hand over her heart. "Oh, that's so sweet. I'm sorry for your loss." She seemed genuinely touched for a moment, but then she continued. "So you've been playing at home all these years? For your family?" The implication was clear. Home playing, family entertainment, nothing serious. "Yes," Margaret said simply. What else could she say? It was the truth. Michael Torres finally looked up from his papers. He was known in the industry as someone who could spot talent in seconds, but also someone who had no patience for amateurs. Juilliard, you said? His voice was skeptical. When was this? Margaret felt her cheeks burn. I was there from 1967 to 1970. I didn't complete the program. Michael nodded slowly, his expression saying everything. That was over 50 years ago. Whatever skills she might have had then would be long gone by now. Robert jumped back in, unable to resist another joke. 1967, wow, that's quite a while ago. I wasn't even born yet. The audience laughed again. So let me get this straight. You haven't performed professionally in over 50 years and you thought, hey, why not try national television? He said it like it was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. Margaret felt something inside her shift. Yes, she was scared. Yes, she felt out of place. But she had not traveled 3 hours on a bus, waited in line all day, and walked onto this stage just to be made fun of. She lifted her chin slightly. Yes, she said, her voice a bit stronger now. That's exactly what I thought. Christina sensed the tension and tried to smooth it over with more fake sweetness. That's very brave of you. So what are you going to play for us today? Margaret felt a small surge of confidence when talking about her music. I'm going to play an excerpt from Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. There was a pause. Michael raised his eyebrows. You're going to play Rachmaninoff? He said it like she had just announced she was going to juggle chainsaws. That's quite an ambitious choice. He exchanged glances with the other judges, and they all seemed to be thinking the same thing. This was going to be a disaster. Robert couldn't help himself. For those of you at home who don't know, Rachmaninoff is basically the hardest thing you can play on a piano. It's like if piano playing was sports, this would be the Olympics. He looked at Margaret with exaggerated concern. Are you sure about this? No offense, but I mean, look at your hands. You've got to have some arthritis at your age, right? Maybe you should play something a little easier. Chopsticks, maybe? The audience laughed loudly at this, and Margaret felt her face go hot with embarrassment and anger. I can manage, Margaret said quietly, but inside her confidence was wavering. Robert had hit on her biggest fear. What if her arthritis did act up? What if her fingers, which had felt fine during her practice that morning, suddenly locked up under the pressure? She flexed her hands slightly, feeling the familiar ache in the joints. Christina was looking at her with pity now. Honey, we just don't want you to be embarrassed. This is a really big stage, really bright lights, lots of pressure. And that piece you mentioned, it's incredibly difficult even for professional concert pianists in their prime. Are you absolutely sure you don't want to choose something else? Margaret thought about it for a moment. She could change her mind. She could play something easier, something that wouldn't make her look foolish if she messed up. But then she thought about why she was here. She wasn't here to play it safe. She had played it safe her whole life. She had given up her dreams to be practical, to be a good wife and mother. She had no regrets about that choice, but now, at 73, she had one last chance to do something for herself, to keep her promise to David, to show her grandson that dreams don't have an expiration date. I'm sure, Margaret said firmly. Michael shrugged. All right, it's your funeral. The moment the words left his mouth, he seemed to realize how insensitive that was, given that she had just mentioned her husband's death. Go ahead. He waved his hand dismissively and sat back in his chair, clearly ready to get this over with. Robert leaned over to Christina and whispered, but his microphone picked it up. This is going to be painful to watch, Christina whispered back. Should we stop her? But Michael shook his head. Let her play. She came all this way. The way he said it made it clear he expected her to fail, but at least she would get her moment. In the audience, people were shifting in their seats. Some looked curious, wondering if maybe this old woman had some hidden talent. But most looked like they were bracing themselves for something embarrassing. A few people had their phones out, ready to record what they assumed would be a viral video of an epic failure. In the front row, a young couple was whispering to each other. This is going to be so cringe, the girl said. I almost feel bad for her. Margaret turned away from the judges and walked a few steps to the piano. She heard Robert say behind her, well, at least the piano bench looks comfortable. If nothing else, she can have a nice sit-down. More laughter from the audience. Margaret's hands were shaking as she placed her folder on the music stand attached to the piano. She sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly. moving it to exactly the right distance from the keys. The piano was beautiful. The keys were smooth and clean, the black wood polished to a mirror shine. She could see her reflection in it, distorted and dark. For a moment, she almost didn't recognize herself. When had she gotten so old? When had her hair turned completely silver? When had these lines appeared on her face, around her eyes and mouth? She looked out at the audience one more time. Hundreds of faces staring back at her, waiting. The judges were still talking amongst themselves, not even really paying attention anymore. The cameras were all pointed at her, red lights glowing, recording every moment. And suddenly Margaret felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. This moment, right now, this was hers. No matter what happened next, no matter how the judges reacted or what the audience thought, she was here. She had made it to this piano. And for the next few minutes, she would be exactly who she was meant to be. She placed her fingers on the keys. They felt cool and smooth under her fingertips. She took one more deep breath, closed her eyes for just a second, and thought of David. "This is for you," she whispered, so quietly that no microphone could catch it. Then she opened her eyes and she began to play. The concert hall held its breath. In that split second before Margaret's fingers touched the keys, there was a perfect, crystal silence. It was the kind of silence that feels almost alive, like the whole world is waiting for something to happen. Margaret's hands hovered just above the ivory keys. Her fingers curved in the exact position she had practiced thousands of times over the past 55 years. She could feel every eye on her. The weight of all that attention should have been crushing, but instead something strange happened. The fear that had been coiling in her stomach began to unwind. Her shaking hands steadied. Her racing heartbeat slowed to a calm, rhythmic pulse. It was as if her body remembered something her mind had forgotten. This was where she belonged. This was what she was meant to do. Behind her, Robert had opened his mouth to make another joke. He was looking down at his notes, probably about to say something about how long this was taking. But Michael reached over and put a hand on his arm. "Wait," Michael said quietly. Something in his voice made Robert close his mouth and look up at the stage. Christina was also suddenly paying attention, leaning forward slightly in her chair. Something had changed in the atmosphere, though none of them could have said exactly what it was. In the audience, a woman in the third row was about to whisper to her husband, but she stopped mid-breath. A teenager who had been scrolling through his phone looked up, drawn by the intensity of the silence. Even the camera operators, who had filmed hundreds of performances and usually stayed detached and professional, found themselves holding their breath. The entire theater seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. Margaret looked down at the keys. She didn't need to look at her sheet music. She had memorized this piece so long ago that the notes were written in her soul. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor. It was a piece about longing and loss, about beauty and pain, about the full, complicated experience of being human. Rachmaninoff had written it after a period of deep depression, and you could hear it in every note. The sadness was there, but so was hope. So was love. So was the determination to keep going even when everything felt impossible. Margaret thought about why she had chosen this piece. It would have been easier to play something simpler, something lighter. But this concerto had been David's favorite. She had played it for him on their wedding day, in the little church with the old upright piano that was slightly out of tune. She had played it when each of their children was born, quietly in the hospital room while David held the sleeping baby. She had played it on anniversaries, on difficult days, on beautiful days, and she had played it at his funeral, though she could barely see the keys through her tears. This piece was her life. Every note contained a memory. Every phrase held an emotion she had felt. The opening chords were like the knock of fate on a door. The melody that followed was yearning, reaching for something just out of grasp. The middle section was turbulent like a storm of feeling. And the ending, if she could get there, was triumphant and bittersweet at once, like saying goodbye to someone you love, knowing you'll carry them with you forever. Her fingers made contact with the keys. The first chord rang out deep and rich and powerful. It was a minor chord, dark and mysterious, and it filled the entire concert hall with sound. The piano was perfectly tuned, and the acoustics of the theater were excellent. The notes seemed to hang in the air, vibrating, alive. Then Margaret's left hand began the rolling, rumbling accompaniment that forms the foundation of the piece. Her fingers moved in a wave-like motion, down and up the keys, creating a sound like distant thunder or the deep movements of the ocean. It was hypnotic and ominous, At the same time, her right hand began the melody, those famous opening notes that anyone who loves classical music would recognize instantly. The effect was immediate and stunning. This was not what anyone had expected. This was not an old woman fumbling through a piece she barely remembered. This was playing at the highest level. The notes were crystal clear, each one perfectly articulated. The rhythm was exact but not rigid, breathing and flowing the way music should, and there was something else, something harder to define. There was emotion in it. Real, deep, honest emotion. In the judges' seats, 3 mouths fell open at almost the same moment. Robert's eyes went wide. Christina's hand flew to her chest. Michael sat up straight, his casual slouch completely gone. He knew music, had spent his entire life around it, and he recognized immediately what he was hearing. This was not just good. This was exceptional. The audience reacted more slowly, but the shift was visible. The people who had been preparing to cringe were now leaning forward in their seats. The ones who had their phones out to record a failure now held them forgotten in their laps, too mesmerized to remember to hit record. The couple in the front row who had expected it to be cringe were staring at the stage with their mouths open. Margaret was no longer thinking about any of them. She had entered that special place that musicians know where time moves differently and nothing exists except the music. Her arthritis, which usually made her fingers ache by the end of the day, was completely forgotten. Her hands were 20 years old again. No, they were ageless. They were just instruments of the music, conduits for something larger than herself. The piece built in intensity. Margaret's fingers flew across the keys with increasing speed and complexity. This was the part that made Rachmaninoff so difficult. The pianist's hands had to stretch to reach notes that were far apart, sometimes spanning more than an octave. The left hand and right hand had to play completely different rhythms at the same time, independent of each other but perfectly coordinated. It required strength, flexibility, and years of practice. It was the kind of thing that young concert pianists spent hours every day working on, and Margaret was playing it flawlessly. Her fingers were a blur of movement. Cascades of notes tumbled from the piano like waterfalls. Powerful chords crashed like waves against rocks. Delicate runs sparkled like sunlight on water. The music filled every corner of the theater, washing over the audience, surrounding them, lifting them. Some people found tears streaming down their faces without knowing why. Others felt chills running down their arms and backs. A few felt their hearts beating faster, as if the music was reaching inside them and touching something they had forgotten was there. Backstage, the stage manager who had walked Margaret to the wings was watching on a monitor. His clipboard hung loose in his hand, forgotten. He had seen hundreds of performances on this show, maybe thousands. He had seen singers who could hit impossible notes, dancers who could defy gravity, magicians who could fool your eyes, but he had never seen anything like this. He grabbed another stagehand by the arm. "Are you seeing this?" he whispered. The other man just nodded, unable to speak. In the control room above the theater, the producers were in chaos. "Get camera 3 closer," one was shouting. "No, camera 1. Camera 1, zoom in on her hands." Another was on the phone. "You need to see this. I don't care what meeting you're in. Get down here now." The director was frantically switching between camera angles, trying to capture every moment, knowing that this was something special, something that doesn't happen often in a lifetime. Back on stage, Margaret had her eyes closed now. She didn't need to see the keys anymore. Her fingers knew where to go. They had traveled this path so many times before that they could find their way in the dark. Her whole body moved with the music, swaying gently, her shoulders rising and falling, her head tilting back during the emotional peaks. She wasn't performing anymore. She was experiencing. She was living inside the music, and the music was living inside her. The melody soared higher, reaching for something beautiful and unattainable. Margaret's face showed everything she was feeling. Pain and joy, loss and love, regret and acceptance, hope and sorrow. All of it was there, honest and raw and real. She wasn't just playing notes on a piano. She was telling a story. She was sharing a life. She was opening her heart and letting everyone see inside. The judges sat frozen, not daring to move, not wanting to break the spell. Michael had tears running down his cheeks, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. Christina had both hands pressed to her mouth. Robert had completely forgotten about jokes, about entertainment, about television. All 3 of them were simply experiencing something pure and true and breathtakingly beautiful, and still Margaret played on. the music building and building toward its climax. The music swelled like a rising tide, filling every corner of the concert hall with sound so rich and full that it felt almost physical. Margaret's hands moved across the keyboard with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone her age. Her fingers struck the keys with perfect weight, not too heavy, not too light, each note singing out clear and true. This was the section of the concerto that required the most technical skill, where many professional pianists stumbled, and Margaret was navigating it like she had been born to play these exact notes. The left hand rumbled in the lower registers, creating a foundation of rolling chords that sounded like the earth itself was moving. The right hand danced in the higher notes, spinning out a melody that was both heartbreaking and hopeful. The two hands worked together in perfect coordination, creating harmonies that made the hair stand up on the back of people's necks. It was the kind of playing that reminds you why humans created music in the first place, why we need it, why it matters. Margaret's training from all those years ago at Juilliard was evident in every phrase. She had been taught by masters, and even though decades had passed, that foundation was still there, solid and unshakable. But there was something more than just technical training. There was a depth of feeling that only comes from living a full life. Every joy she had experienced, every sorrow she had endured, every moment of love and loss and hope and fear, all of it was flowing through her fingers into the music. When she had been young and studying at Juilliard, she could play the notes perfectly, but she hadn't fully understood what they meant. She was too young to comprehend the depths of emotion that Rachmaninoff had poured into this piece. But now, at 73, having loved and lost, having raised children and buried her husband, having lived through disappointments and small victories, having felt the full weight of a human life, now she understood. And that understanding transformed the music from a series of notes into something transcendent. The audience was completely transfixed. People sat motionless, barely breathing, afraid that any movement might break the spell. Some had tears streaming down their faces. A man in the balcony had his hand over his heart, feeling it pound with the rhythm of the music. A young woman in the orchestra section was gripping her boyfriend's hand so tightly that her knuckles were white. An elderly man in the back row had his eyes closed, and on his face was an expression of such pure emotion that the camera operator who caught it had to blink away his own tears. Even the cynical production crew, who had seen everything and prided themselves on being hard to impress, were affected. The camera operators forgot to get their creative shots. They just pointed their cameras at Margaret and let them roll, capturing this moment in its raw, unedited truth. The audio technicians were mesmerized by the sound coming through their headphones, the purest, most beautiful piano playing they had ever heard. One of them was actually crying, tears dripping onto his soundboard. Christina, the pop star judge, was openly weeping now. She had built her career on emotion, on connecting with audiences through feeling, and she recognized a master at work. This was what she had been trying to achieve her whole career, this level of genuine, unfiltered emotion. And here was this 73-year-old woman in a simple blue blouse, doing it effortlessly, making it look easy. Christina realized in that moment how much she still had to learn, how far she still had to go. Robert, the comedian, was having a different kind of revelation. His entire career was built on irony and sarcasm, on keeping the world at arm's length with jokes and clever comments. He made fun of things before they could touch him. But this music, this performance, it had broken through all his defenses. It had reached past the jokes and the smirks and touched something real inside him, something he usually kept buried. He thought about his own mother, who had passed away 5 years ago. She had played piano too, just simple songs around the house. He wished she could have heard this. He wished he had listened more carefully when she played. Michael, the music producer, was experiencing something that rarely happened to him anymore. He had been in the music industry for 40 years. He had discovered dozens of major artists. He had sat through thousands of auditions and performances, and somewhere along the way he had become jaded. He had heard it all, seen it all, and it had become harder and harder to impress him. Music had become a product, a commodity to be packaged and sold. But this reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. This was art in its purest form. This was a human soul expressing itself through sound. This was truth. Margaret moved into the next section of the concerto, a part that was softer but no less intense. Here the notes became more sparse, more delicate, like raindrops falling one at a time. Her right hand played a melody that was so beautiful, so achingly tender that it felt like the piano itself was weeping. She played with such control, such perfect dynamics, bringing the volume down to barely a whisper without losing any of the emotional intensity. This was perhaps even more difficult than the loud, fast sections. Any pianist can bang on the keys and make noise. But to play this softly, this gently while maintaining clarity and feeling, that required a level of mastery that took decades to develop. Each note had to be perfectly weighted, perfectly timed. The sustain pedal had to be used with incredible precision, lifting at just the right moments to keep the harmonies clear but not letting them blur together. And Margaret did it flawlessly. Her foot worked the pedal like she was part of the piano itself. Her hands barely seemed to move now, just her fingers pressing the keys with the lightest touch, coaxing out sounds that were barely louder than a breath but somehow filled the entire hall. The audience leaned forward, straining to hear every note, not wanting to miss a single moment. Then, gradually, the music began to build again. The volume increased, the tempo quickened. Margaret's hands began to move faster, her whole body swaying with the rhythm. This was the final build toward the climax, where all the themes that had been introduced earlier came together in a triumphant resolution. It was like climbing a mountain, each phrase taking you higher and higher until you reached the peak and could see the whole world spread out below you. Margaret's face was radiant now. Her eyes were still closed, but there was a smile on her lips. Not a performing smile, but a genuine expression of pure joy. This was why she played. This was why she had practiced every single day for 55 years, even when no one was listening but herself. For this feeling, this connection between her soul and the music, between her hands and the keys, between her heart and the hearts of everyone listening. The music reached its peak, a cascade of notes tumbling over each other like a waterfall, building in speed and volume until it seemed like the piano itself might explode with the force of it. Margaret's hands flew across the keyboard, left hand and right hand working in perfect synchronization, playing passages that required her fingers to reach incredible distances, to move at incredible speeds, to maintain incredible accuracy even while everything was happening so fast. And then suddenly the storm calmed. The final section began, the resolution. The chaos settled into peace. The melody returned, transformed now, no longer yearning but fulfilled. The harmonies that had been tense and unresolved throughout the piece finally found their home. It was like watching the sun come out after a storm, like taking your first breath after being underwater, like finding something you thought you had lost forever. Margaret played these final phrases with such tenderness, such love, such acceptance. Her hands moved slowly now, savoring each note, letting each chord ring out fully before moving to the next. She was saying goodbye, not just to the piece but to something larger. Goodbye to youth, goodbye to dreams deferred, goodbye to the person she had been, and hello to the person she had become. Goodbye to David, but also hello to his memory, to the love they had shared, to the promise she was finally keeping. The last chord came, a simple C major chord, bright and clear and final. Margaret held it, letting it sustain, her foot on the pedal, the sound filling the hall and slowly, slowly fading into silence. Her hands lifted from the keys. She opened her eyes. And for a moment, just a brief moment before the world came rushing back, there was perfect silence, complete, total, absolute silence. The kind of silence that only exists in the space between one breath and the next, between the end of one thing and the beginning of another. And then, like a dam breaking, the applause began. The applause started as a wave from the back of the theater and rolled forward, gathering strength and volume as it came. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet. People weren't just clapping, they were cheering, shouting, some of them crying as they applauded. The sound was deafening, a roar of approval and joy and pure amazement that echoed off the walls and ceiling of the concert hall. Margaret sat at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys, completely overwhelmed. She blinked in the bright stage lights, trying to process what was happening. The standing ovation continued, growing louder if anything. People clapping harder, some stomping their feet, others whistling. She had never experienced anything like this in her entire life. During her time at Juilliard, she had played in recitals for small audiences of students and faculty. She had played at her wedding for maybe 50 people. But this was something else entirely. She turned on the bench to look out at the audience, and the sight made her gasp. Every single person was standing. Every single person was clapping. Hundreds of faces, some with tears streaming down them, all looking at her with expressions of wonder and appreciation. Margaret felt her own tears start to fall, and she brought her hands to her face, unable to believe what she was seeing. The judges were standing too. Christina was applauding with her hands above her head, tears running freely down her cheeks, not caring that her makeup was probably ruined. Robert was clapping so hard that his hands must have hurt, and on his face was an expression of genuine respect, all his earlier mockery completely forgotten. And Michael, the legendary producer who was known for being tough and unemotional, was wiping tears from his eyes with one hand while clapping with the other, nodding his head slowly as if to say, yes, that's what real music sounds like. The ovation continued for a full minute, then 2 minutes. It showed no signs of stopping. The host of the show, who usually rushed performers off the stage to keep the show moving, stood to the side with a huge smile on his face, letting the moment happen. Even he, who had seen hundreds of performances on this show, recognized that this was special. The cameras captured everything, zooming in on Margaret's tearful face, panning across the ecstatic audience, catching close-ups of the judges' reactions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably about 3 minutes, the applause began to fade. People sat back down, though many were still wiping their eyes and turning to their neighbors to express their amazement. The host walked to the center of the stage, still smiling broadly. "Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret Chen," he announced, setting off another burst of applause. He walked over to Margaret, who was still sitting at the piano, and offered her his hand to help her stand. She took it gratefully, her legs shaking as she stood. "How are you feeling right now?" the host asked, holding the microphone toward her. Margaret's voice was thick with emotion when she spoke. "I don't know what to say. I can't believe this is happening. I just wanted to keep my promise to my husband. I never expected any of this." Her words set off another wave of appreciative applause from the audience. The host nodded sympathetically, then turned toward the judges. "Well, I think it's time to hear from our judges. Let's start with you, Robert." The comedian stood up from his seat and walked around the judges' table toward the stage. His expression was serious in a way that people who knew him from television had rarely seen. When he reached the stage, he walked right up to Margaret and did something unexpected. He hugged her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice catching slightly, "I need to apologize to you. Before you played, I made jokes. I didn't take you seriously, and I was totally wrong." He pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were red. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard on this stage in the 5 years I've been a judge on this show. You made me feel things I haven't felt in years. You reminded me of my mother. You reminded me why art matters. I'm so sorry for doubting you, and I'm so grateful that you came here today." The audience applauded his words, and many people appreciated his honesty. Margaret smiled at him through her tears. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means so much." Robert walked back to the judges' table, and now it was Christina's turn. She didn't walk, she ran. She practically leaped onto the stage and grabbed Margaret's hands in hers. "Oh my God," Christina kept saying. "I don't even have words. I'm a professional singer. I've been performing my whole life, and you just taught me more about music and emotion in 5 minutes than I've learned in my entire career." She was crying so hard she could barely speak. "Your husband must have been so proud of you, and wherever he is, I know he's smiling right now. That was a gift. Thank you for sharing it with us." Margaret was crying harder now, too. "Thank you, dear," she managed to say. Christina hugged her tightly, then walked back to her seat, still wiping her eyes. Now all eyes turned to Michael. He was still sitting at the judges' table, but he was leaning forward, his hands clasped together, staring at Margaret with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, and the microphone picked up every word. "Margaret," he said, and even saying her name seemed to cost him some effort. "I've been in the music industry for 40 years. I've worked with the greatest artists of our generation. I've been in recording studios with legends. I've attended concerts at the finest halls in the world. And what you just did, what I just witnessed, is among the top performances I've ever heard." He paused, seeming to struggle with his emotions. That wasn't just technically perfect, though it was. That wasn't just musically sophisticated, though it was. That was art in its purest form. That was a human soul expressing itself through music, and it was absolutely extraordinary. He stood up from his chair and walked slowly to the stage, Margaret watched him approach, this legendary figure in the music world, and she felt like she was dreaming. Michael climbed the stairs to the stage and stood in front of her. "You mentioned you studied at Juilliard but didn't finish the program. Can I ask why you left?" Margaret took a shaky breath. "I got married. My husband, David, he was wonderful, but he came from a traditional family. They expected me to be a wife and mother, not a performer. And that's what I chose. I don't regret it. I had a beautiful life, 4 wonderful children, 6 grandchildren. But music was always there in the background. I played at home, practiced when I could. I never stopped loving it." Michael nodded slowly. "What you just demonstrated is that real talent doesn't fade. Real artistry doesn't disappear just because you're not performing professionally. You've clearly practiced, clearly maintained your skills, but more than that, you've lived. You've experienced life in all its complexity, and that came through in every single note you played. That's something you can't teach. That's something you can only earn through time and experience." He looked out at the audience, then back at Margaret. "When you walked onto this stage, I'll be honest, I didn't expect much. I'm sorry for that. But you've reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. You've reminded everyone here what's possible when someone dedicates themselves to their art." He extended his hand. "It would be an absolute honor if you would let me help you record an album. I want the world to hear what we just heard." The audience erupted again. Margaret's mouth fell open in shock. "An album? But I'm 73 years old." Michael smiled, a real genuine smile. "That's exactly why we need to do it. The world needs to hear your story. They need to hear what dedication and passion sound like. What do you say?" Margaret looked out at the audience, at all those faces smiling at her, encouraging her. She thought about David, about the promise she had made. She thought about her grandson, Tommy, who had believed in her. She thought about that 18-year-old girl who had walked into Juilliard with stars in her eyes and dreams in her heart. And she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I would love that." The theater exploded with applause again. Christina was jumping up and down in her seat. Robert was clapping over his head. The host was grinning from ear to ear. And Michael just nodded, satisfied, as if he had just discovered the next big thing, which in a way he had. As Margaret walked off the stage, her legs still shaking, her heart still pounding, she felt like she was floating. The stage manager who had walked her to the stage earlier was waiting in the wings, and he had tears in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, "that was the most incredible thing I've ever seen." Other crew members came up to her, congratulating her, some asking for autographs. Margaret felt overwhelmed, but also deeply, profoundly happy. Backstage, her phone was ringing. It was Tommy, her grandson, calling even though he knew she was supposed to be on stage. She answered it. Grandma, I'm watching it on TV. You were amazing. You were so amazing." He was crying and laughing at the same time. I told you everyone needed to hear you play." Margaret laughed through her tears. "You did, sweetheart. You were right." In the background, she could hear her other grandchildren cheering and her children talking excitedly. They had all gathered at her daughter's house to watch the show together. "We're so proud of you, Mom," her oldest son shouted into the phone. "Dad would be so proud." The video appeared online before the show even finished airing. Someone in the audience had recorded Margaret's performance on their phone and uploaded it to social media within minutes. By the time the show ended 2 hours later, the clip had already been viewed over 1 million times. By the next morning, it had reached 50 million views. By the end of the week, it had been watched over 200 million times, making it the most viewed clip in the show's entire history. Margaret woke up the morning after her performance to find her phone flooded with notifications. Her children had to come over and help her figure out what was happening. Her daughter sat with her at the kitchen table, scrolling through the messages and comments. "Mom, look at this. This person says your performance made them want to take piano lessons again, after giving up 20 years ago. And this one says they called their estranged mother after watching you play because it reminded them that life is too short to stay angry." The messages kept coming, thousands upon thousands of them from all over the world. A man from Japan wrote that he had been about to give up on his dream of becoming a painter, but Margaret's story inspired him to keep trying. A woman from Brazil said she had watched the video with her 90-year-old grandmother, and they both cried together. A teenager from Australia wrote that he had shown the video to his music teacher, who told him he was too old to start learning piano at 16, and now both of them understood that it's never too late. Margaret's story touched something deep in people. It wasn't just about the music, though the music was extraordinary. It was about the message behind it. That dreams don't have expiration dates, that talent and passion don't disappear with age, that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. In a world that often seems obsessed with youth, with being the youngest to achieve something, Margaret's story was a powerful reminder that age can bring depth, wisdom, and a kind of beauty that only comes with living a full life. The show's producers were thrilled, of course. The ratings for that episode were the highest they'd had in years. But more than that, something had shifted in the show itself. After Margaret's performance, they started taking older contestants more seriously. They stopped looking for just young, flashy performers and started appreciating talent wherever they found it. The mockery and cruel jokes that had been part of the show's formula started to feel hollow and mean. Margaret had, in a way, changed the entire culture of the show. Margaret easily advanced through the competition. In the semifinals, she played Chopin and received another standing ovation. In the finals, she performed part of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata and won the competition with the highest vote total in the show's history. But for Margaret, the prize money was never the point. What mattered more were the opportunities that started coming her way. Michael Torres was true to his word. He arranged for Margaret to record an album at one of the finest recording studios in Los Angeles. The experience was overwhelming for Margaret at first. She had never worked with professional sound engineers, never recorded in a studio with equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But Michael guided her through it patiently, and what emerged was something beautiful. The album was called Promises Kept, and it featured classical pieces that had meant something special to Margaret throughout her life. Rachmaninoff's concerto was there, of course, but also Chopin nocturnes that she had played for her children when they were babies, Beethoven sonatas that she had practiced during difficult times in her marriage, Debussy pieces that reminded her of spring mornings. Each piece came with liner notes where Margaret explained what the music meant to her, turning the album into not just a collection of performances, but a musical autobiography. The album was released 6 months after her appearance on the show, and it was an immediate success. It reached a #1 on the classical music charts and even crossed over to the mainstream charts, something classical albums rarely do. Critics raved about it. The New York Times music critic wrote, "Margaret Chen plays with the depth of feeling that comes from a life fully lived. Her technical skill is impressive, but it's her emotional honesty that makes this album essential listening." But more important to Margaret than the sales or the reviews were the invitations that started arriving. Concert halls around the country wanted her to perform. She gave her first professional concert at Carnegie Hall in New York City, a venue she had once dreamed of playing as a young student at Juilliard. Standing on that stage, looking out at the sold-out audience, she felt the presence of her younger self, that 18-year-old girl with so many dreams, and she felt like she was finally fulfilling a promise not just to David, but to that girl as well. The tour continued. She played in Boston, in Chicago, and San Francisco. Each concert sold out within hours of tickets going on sale. The audiences were diverse, not just older classical music fans, but young people too, teenagers and college students who had seen her video and been inspired by her story. After each concert, Margaret would stay and talk to audience members, sign autographs, and listen to their stories. So many people wanted to tell her how she had changed their lives. An elderly man in Philadelphia told her he had been depressed since his wife died, but hearing Margaret's music gave him a reason to keep going. A young woman in Seattle said she had dropped out of art school because her parents thought it was impractical, but Margaret's story gave her the courage to go back. A middle-aged man in Denver said he had been working a job he hated for 20 years, and watching Margaret pursue her dream at 73 made him finally quit and start the business he had always wanted to run. Margaret became a voice for people who felt they had missed their chance, who thought they were too old, too late, too ordinary to pursue their passions. She gave interviews where she spoke honestly about her choices, about giving up her music career for her family, about the years of quiet practice at home while the world moved on without her. But she was always careful to say that she didn't regret her choices. Her life had been full and meaningful. She just wished someone had told her younger self that it didn't have to be either or, that it's possible to have a family and a career, that women shouldn't have to choose. She also became an advocate for arts education in schools. She visited schools around the country, talking to students about the importance of music and art in their lives. She donated money to music programs that were being cut due to budget constraints. She set up a scholarship fund at Juilliard for older students returning to their studies, knowing that she might have come back herself if such opportunities had existed when she was raising her children. A year after her television appearance, Margaret was invited to perform at the White House. She played for the President and First Lady at a state dinner, and afterward, the President told her that her story represented the best of what America could be, a place where it's never too late to pursue your dreams. The video of that performance also went viral, introducing her to even more people around the world. Margaret's relationship with her family deepened during this time. Her children and grandchildren were incredibly proud of her, of course, but more than that, they saw her in a new light. She wasn't just mom or grandma anymore. She was Margaret, a person with her own dreams and talents and story. Tommy, her grandson who had encouraged her to audition, became her assistant, helping her manage her schedule and the flood of opportunities that kept coming. He took a gap year from college to travel with her, and the time they spent together created a bond that would last the rest of their lives. On the second anniversary of David's death, Margaret gave a special concert in their hometown. She played in the same small church where they had gotten married 55 years earlier. The old upright piano had been replaced with a grand piano for the occasion, donated by an anonymous benefactor who had been moved by Margaret's story. The church was packed with people from the community who had known her and David for decades. Before she played, Margaret spoke to the audience. "When David was dying, he made me promise to share my music with the world. I think he knew that I had given up something important, and he didn't want me to go through the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Keeping that promise has been the hardest and most rewarding thing I've ever done, but I want you all to know that the years I spent with him raising our family, living a quiet life, those were not wasted years. Those years gave me the depth and understanding to play music the way I play it now. Every note I play carries the memory of a life well lived, a love well loved." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. "This performance is for David, and for everyone who has ever wondered if it's too late to chase a dream. It's not. It's never too late." The performance that night was perhaps her most emotional yet. She played pieces that David had loved, and in the audience people who had known them both as a couple cried openly, remembering their friend and neighbor, celebrating the love that had endured beyond death. After the concert, people lined up for hours just to hug Margaret, to thank her, to tell her what her music meant to them. As Margaret's 74th birthday approached, she released her second album,